What historical fact makes you cry? A story from my great-grandfather who fought in World War I. Soldiers would cease fire to pick up their men's bodies and would have a smoke together, go back to their trenches and start firing again. Neither side of frontline soldiers actually wanted to be there, just drafted for war. There's a line from the song and the band played Waltzing Matilda that talks about this, and a band played Waltzing Matilda as we stopped to bury our slain, and we buried ours and the Turks buried theirs. Then it started all over again. It doesn't exactly make me cry, but Albert Göring, the staunchly anti-Nazi brother of Hermann Göring, spent the Second World War helping Jews and dissidents to escape. He was caught several times, but was let off the hook due to his brother's influence within the Reich. After the war, he was shunned for his last name and his accomplishments forgotten. I take solace in the fact that he never did it for the recognition. Some of the world's greatest deeds have come from nameless men and women. The rape of Nanking in 1937. Looking up photos of what the Japanese did there left me silent for a while. They raped and murdered women, bayoneted babies. You can look up a photo of it, used the wounded as rifle and bayonet practice, forced mothers on their sons and fathers on their daughters, and made a contest out of beheading civilians. There is a Japanese newspaper article you can look up about it. It's disgusting, and the worst part about it is that the Japanese government denies most of these acts, along with a lot of other war crimes that they committed afterwards. It always shakes me to my core to know that human beings are capable of doing such horrible things to one another, and smile while doing it. After the Pearl Harbor attack, at least some men were alive in a pocket of air inside one of the capsized ships. Navy personnel could hear them banging on the hull and trying to signal for help, but there was no way to get at them safely. The water was full of fuel and oil, so blowtorches weren't a workable idea, and there was no way for divers to get into the ship because the damage had rendered the whole thing a death trap of twisted steel. There wasn't even any way to communicate with the trapped men, so the guards at Pearl Harbor had to listen to those calls for help getting weaker and weaker, while inside everyone slowly suffocated. When they hauled the ship up for scrap later, there were 16 notches scratched onto the wall of that compartment, which means at least one casualty of Pearl Harbor lived until the 23rd of December, 1941. God dang, 16 days. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. The doors to the exit and the stairwells were locked, so you either had to jump out the window or be burned alive. I'm sure I am paraphrasing, but regulations are written in blood. Sacagawea, who accompanied Lewis and Clark on their expedition to explore the lands we now know as the Western United States, had a vital coincidence on the journey that always makes me emotional to think about. She was born a Shoshone but was taken around the age of 12 and made a slave to the Hidatsa. After being with them for 3 or so years, she was sold to a French man named Toussaint Charbonneau, who took her as a wife. When Lewis and Clark met her, she was about 16 years old and pregnant with Charbonneau's child. The birth was a tough one and Lewis helped with the child's safe delivery before Sacagawea and Charbonneau joined them on the expedition. Lewis and Clark knew they would meet the Shoshone on their journey and were hoping Sacagawea could help them procure some supplies, especially horses, to help them cross the Rocky Mountains. Sacagawea didn't speak English. She spoke Shoshone and Hidatsa. Charbonneau spoke Hidatsa and French, and one of the members of Lewis and Clark's expedition spoke French and English. Suffice to say, translation was complicated and complex. When the expedition finally came upon the Shoshone's territory, they agreed to meet and hear Lewis and Clark's proposal. They sat down around the fire and began negotiations. The chief of the tribe began to speak with Sacagawea and the conversation proceeded rapidly. The others, unable to really understand what was going on, were confused when she and the chief began to cry, and then to embrace. In the years since her capture, it turned out, Sacagawea's brother had become chief. He had believed her dead and she did not recognize him at first. The celebration, when the tribe learned who she was, and the appreciation bestowed upon Lewis and Clark for returning her, is hard to completely express. From Wikipedia, Lewis recorded their reunion in his journal, shortly after Captain Clark arrived with the interpreter Charbonneau and the Indian woman, who proved to be a sister of the chief Camuite. The meeting of those people was really affecting, particularly between Sacagawea and an Indian woman, who had been taken prisoner at the same time with her, and who had afterwards escaped from the Minotaurs and rejoined her nation. Whenever I start to think about what she went through, from her capture and slavery among the Hidatsus, to her being taken as a wife by Charbonneau, traveling across largely unknown lands with people whose language she didn't speak, to finally being reunited with her family, it always makes me emotional. She went through so much. One of the girls in the Donner Party was fed her dead mother and told afterwards. They had an agreement to not feed people their family members, but they had broken off from the camp in an attempt to find rescue. She would randomly burst into tears about it at school years later. The whole story of the Donner Party is so horrible and sad, and it bothers me that it's just used for cannibal jokes. Teddy Roosevelt's mother Mitty and his wife Alice, who had just given birth days before, both died in the same house on the same day, hours apart from each other. In his diary entry that day, he drew a large black X and scribbled, "The light has gone out of my life." That's some heavy crap right there, man. He lost his son Quentin too in World War I. I learned about this in a Dan Carlin podcast. During the German-Soviet War, there was a Red Army soldier who sang each night with a hauntingly beautiful voice. His comrades would give him their tea rations and scarves to protect his larynx. One night, he couldn't sing because he had gotten sick. A German soldier crawled across no man's land and tossed something into the Soviet trench. The Soviet soldiers thought it was a grenade. However, it was a package containing a letter asking if the singer was okay and if he needed medicine. A truly heartwarming moment in an otherwise horrific front. Virginia Woolf's suicide and the note she left behind makes me freaking weep like a baby. Just the way she expresses sentiments of happiness and love to her husband, but also her guilt and struggle with mental illness, it just kills me. Please look into her sister, Vanessa Bell. She was there through it all and was the inspiration for many of her books. Vanessa also painted the covers for many, as well as a hauntingly beautiful portrait of Woolf. A letter from the Civil War by Sullivan Ballou. My very dear Sarah, the indications are very strong that we shall move in a few days, perhaps tomorrow. Lest I should not be able to write again, I feel impelled to write a few lines that may fall under your eye when I shall be no more. I have no misgivings about, or lack of confidence in the cause in which I am engaged, and my courage does not halt or falter. I know how strongly American civilization now leans on the triumph of the government and how great a debt we owe to those who went before us through the blood and sufferings of the revolution. And I am willing, perfectly willing, to lay down all my joys in this life, to help maintain this government, and to pay that debt. Sarah, my love for you is deathless. It seems to bind me with mighty cables that nothing but omnipotence could break, and yet my love of country comes over me like a strong wind and bears me unresistably on with all these chains to the battlefield. The memories of the blissful moments I have spent with you come creeping over me, and I feel most gratified to God and to you that I have enjoyed them for so long. And hard it is for me to give them up and burn to ashes the hopes of future years, when, God willing, we might still have lived and loved together, and seen our sons grown up to honorable manhood, around us. I know, but few and small claims upon divine providence, but something whispers to me, perhaps it is the wafted prayer of my little Edgar, that I shall return to my loved ones unharmed. If I do not, my dear Sarah, never forget how much I love you, and when my last breath escapes me on the battlefield, it will whisper your name. Forgive my many faults and the many pains I have caused you. How thoughtless and foolish I have oftentimes been. How gladly would I wash out with my tears every little spot upon your happiness. But, oh Sarah, if the dead can come back to this earth and flit unseen around those they loved, I shall always be near you, in the gladdest days and in the darkest nights, always, always, and if there be a soft breeze upon your cheek, it shall be my breath. As the cool air fans your throbbing temple, it shall be my spirit passing by. Sarah, do not mourn me dead. Think I am gone and wait for thee, for we shall meet again. Sullivan Ballou was killed a week later at the First Battle of Bull Run, the 21st of July, 1861. The kneel down of Willy Brandt, German Chancellor of 1969 to 1974. He was visiting the ghetto of Warsaw and kneeled to apologize for the German war crimes, surprising everybody. The thing that really gets to me was the backstory. Brandt emigrated Germany in 1934 for being a social democrat and for having been in the resistance. He spent his time in Oslo until he was captured by Nazi soldiers there and was able to flee to Sweden. The press releases of the time really capture the strength of the moment, and I'm sorry for my translation. This is what Hermann Schreiber wrote in Der Spiegel. Dan Nieder, der das nicht nötig hat, dafür all, die es nötig haben, aber nicht verdienen, weil sie es nicht wagen oder nicht können oder nicht wagen können. Dan bekannte sich zu einer Schuld, an der es selber nicht zu tragen hat, und bittet Vergebung, der es selber nicht bedarf. Dan Nieder für Deutschland. There he kneels, he, who does not have to, for those who would have to, but who are not kneeling, because they cannot, or because they do not dare to, or because they cannot dare to kneel. There he admits to a guilt he does not have to bear and asks for a forgiveness he does not need. There he is, kneeling for Germany. Poor Willy Brandt got fricked over so badly for something that wasn't even really his fault. For people not in the know, his political career was essentially murdered because East Germany revealed that one of his high-level aides was actually a Stasi agent, causing him to lose all credibility overnight. Most if not all the astronauts aboard the Challenger survived the explosion. It was the crash into the water that would have killed them. Irish unmarried moms were sometimes required to live in institutions, raising their own babies until they were adopted. Imagine knowing how cute your kid was, taking care of it, knowing you couldn't keep it. Sometimes they were as old as 2 or 3 when adopted. The movie Philomena dealt with this topic. There is a sad but powerful Irish movie called The Magdalene Sisters about several girls in one of these places, and it is so heartbreaking. One of my favorite films though. Absolutely check it out if the subject interests you. When Alexander Hamilton's eldest son died, his second child Angelica Hamilton had a mental breakdown and she never recovered. Sometimes, her family would walk into a room with only her in it, and she would be speaking to her dead brother. World War I mercy dogs. They would go out into no man's land and find wounded soldiers. They would bring medical supplies for the soldiers to patch themselves up, or if the soldier was too mortally wounded, stay and comfort them in their final moments. The end of a Sappho poem. Beyond all hope, I prayed those timeless days we spent might be made twice as long. I prayed one word, I want. Someone, I tell you, will remember us, even in another time. That quote always make me tear up. The great tragedy, or greater, is that for all the works she wrote only 2 remain in their full form. I remember reading somewhere that a lot of poem fragments were found in ancient garbage dumps, preserved across centuries. Quite amazing really, but sad too, that so much of her artistry was lost. There were approximately 300 infants and children that were murdered in Johnstown, being forcibly fed or injected with cyanide. I feel so much pain for all the victims, but the kids in particular make me ache with despair. There were some teens that weren't among the number, because they were gone playing a basketball tournament. Dangerfield Newby, one of the 3 black men who died in the raid on Harper's Ferry, had a letter from his enslaved wife on his person. He had been working to buy her and his children, but her owner kept raising the price. During World War II, the Japanese army had comfort stations which served as prisons for women who were taken against their will. They would routinely form lines to take turn in raping and torturing the women trapped in these prison cells. This is just one of Japan's horrid actions during the war. Unit 731 and the Nanjing Massacre are other examples. Henry Gunter was an American soldier killed during World War I at 10:59 am on November 11, 1918. 1 minute before the armistice took effect at 11 am, Gunter charged a German roadblock outfitted with machine guns. German soldiers tried waving him off, knowing the war would come to an end in mere moments. Apparently he got too close, fired a couple rounds, and was promptly shot and killed instantly. Sounds more like suicide by Central Powers. Through genealogy, I found an old newspaper reporting an accident that happened. My 4 ex-great-grandmother and grandfather were crossing the river into Maine from Canada when their wagon tipped. He and 5 children survived. My 4 ex-great-grandmother and month-old baby did not. That tugged at my heart. I cannot imagine the devastation he and his children felt as they were moving. There was also a lot of stillborns and a lot of children who never saw past the age of 10. It's quite a sad journey at times. Reminds me of a story my grandmother told me recently. My grandfather, also Canadian, was one of 12 children. His mother died during childbirth along with the 13th child, leaving 12 mourning children and a husband. His father ended up remarrying and she raised all 12 children as her own. The Sand Creek Massacre is particularly bad. They had so much faith in the peace treaties that had been signed, the signs of good faith from American settlers, only to be massacred. The leader of the camp, Black Kettle, desperately holding up the American flag he'd been given with a white flag underneath it, encouraging his people to gather around it, thinking that the settlers would realize they were allies and stop the killings, only to be shot down. The descriptions of the massacre are brutal: children tortured and slaughtered, pregnant women with their children torn out of their stomachs, genitals torn from corpses and taken for trophies. It really made me realize you can never underestimate the cruelty of mankind, especially considering most of the murdered in this massacre were defenseless women, children, and elderly. In World War II, an American pilot named Charles Brown was flying a B-17 in a bomb raid over Germany where his aircraft was severely shot up and entered a free fall when Brown passed out. When Brown awoke, he was only a few thousand feet above the ground and barely was able to recover the aircraft. When the Luftwaffe spotted a limping B-17 far below the formation, they dispatched a pilot named Franz Stigler, a soon-to-be ace just one kill away, with 2 downed B-17s earlier that day. As he approached from the rear, Stigler noticed that the B-17's tail gunner didn't move, and after further inspection, realized he and several other gunners were dead. Stigler saw this and remembered what his flight instructor had said years ago: "If you shoot a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." Stigler saw this limping B-17 as no different from a downed pilot in a parachute. To prevent German flak cannons from taking it out, Stigler flew in formation with the B-17 all the way until the English Channel, where it landed safely. Stigler never mentioned the incident, and cold being court-martialed for it. Decades later, Charles went looking for the enemy pilot that saved his life that fateful day, and eventually met him face to face, becoming close friends and dying just a few months apart from each other in 2008. Stigler, next to Brown's deathbed: "You're holding my hand, Chuck, you sly dog." Almost a quarter of Europe's military-age males died in World War I. The total number of deaths includes from 9 to 11 million military personnel. The civilian death toll was about 6 to 13 million. The casualties in individual battles were insane. For example, 306,000 people died at the Battle of Verdun over the course of 1916. At the Battle of the Somme, almost 1 million were wounded or killed. I think World War I tends to get overshadowed by World War II. Not that it should be a competition, but it's like the atrocities of the Holocaust is already more than our brains can comprehend. And it has such clear good guys bad guys, where World War I was really just dudes fighting for their countries. The killing fields and the tree: the Red Khmer used to kill infants and small children by smashing them against it. One of the most haunting things I've ever read about. Anime Aquash, Native woman who was involved with the American Indian Movement, AIM, was shot in the back of the head execution style. The investigation around her murder was shady and involved the FBI cutting off her hands with the premise that her corpse needed to be fingerprinted. I first learned about her in the first pages of Lakota Woman, a memoir by Mary Brave Bird, who was one of her closest friends and who wrote about the murder and how the FBI cut off her hands. I have not been able to stop thinking about Anna's dismembered hands since I read it. Mary also wrote about the involuntary sterilization of Native women in her community, which was widespread through at least the 1970s. The disembodiment and disrespect of Native women haunt me and will haunt me for the rest of my life, especially as a woman and a Native descendant. I hadn't heard of this until now and I feel sick. Thank you for sharing her story. The treatment of children, in particular, by Joseph Mengele at the concentration camps during World War II. Freaking brutal. And now that I have kids of my own, it tears me up anytime I hear about it. That man was a monster. Genocide of Srebrenica in 1995. The entire world, apart from poor powerless UN soldiers, looked away as thousands of civilians were executed. In general, I can't believe how much evil and cruelty took place in former Yugoslavia not that long ago. Breakup of the Kalmar Union. Basically this kick-ass Danish queen united Denmark, Norway, Sweden and Finland, only for her crappy heir to frick it all up. Same. Although Finland was a dependency at the time, Sweden, just like Iceland, Norway. Pictures of a box of wedding rings taken from the corpses of Jewish people in concentration camps. It just makes me so sad that the only remembrance of their spouse, who could be dead for all they know, is stolen from them and they are unceremoniously buried without their ring. Then the rings are carelessly stored in a wooden box to be melted down. That one of the world's most talented mathematicians died around the age of 40 because he was gay and lived in a country that had made it illegal to be. Alan Turing. He was one of the people we can thank for having computers today and that World War II didn't last longer. He didn't just die, he was chemically castrated after he helped the Allies crack the Nazi code. That's fricked up. This is my highest rated upvoted comment ever. The fact that Anne Frank died just 2 weeks before the camps were liberated. Every time I read her diary other books about it I get this weird sense of hope for her, even though I know it's crazy, because of the timing. Anne Frank's death at the age of 15, hiding from Nazis, had contracted typhus, couldn't recover from it and left her diary for us. Her last words from her diary: "As I've told you many times, I'm split in two. One side contains my exuberant cheerfulness, my flippancy, my joy in life and, above all, my ability to appreciate the lighter side of things. By that I mean not finding anything wrong with flirtations, a kiss, an embrace, an off-color joke. This side of me is usually lying in wait to ambush the other one, which is much purer, deeper and finer." The story of Alex, 1977 to 2007. An African grey parrot who learned to speak, recognize objects and play with his owner. It was one of the smartest parrots ever reported. He loved his owner and his owner adored him as well. In the end, he suffered arteriosclerosis, so his owner went to see him one last time, to which Alex told his owner, "You are good. I love you." She replied, "I love you too." He said, "I'll see you tomorrow," and she replied, "Yes, I'll see you tomorrow." Christmas Day, 1914. German and British soldiers got up from their trenches and called a 48-hour truce to just chill and even play soccer. This makes me cry because it shows that the soldiers of both sides really found it pointless to fight other people just cause their country said so. This is probably the strongest story of unity I've heard about in history class. They also exchanges small gifts at times by throwing them over to the enemy, jars of tobacco or meat and candy. Tibetan monks who spend their lives in solitude are often murdered as their deep sense of self is too unwavering for their local government. Modern history makes me sad. Well, China already made probably hundreds of human violations. Because of them we won't get a next Dalai Lama. It's gotta be Franz Ferdinand's last words, considering he was so sympathetic to the Serbian cause only to be killed by a Serbian nationalist himself, and was begging his wife to stay alive for their children as she was pregnant, and trying to assure the people around him that he was fine as he slowly faded into death, and it ended up starting an event which then decided the whole course of the 20th century. For those looking for the last words which were omitted from OP, as reported by Count Herach, Franz Ferdinand's last words were "Sophie, Sophie, don't die, lie for our children," followed by 6 or 7 utterances of "it is nothing," in response to Herach's inquiry as to Franz Ferdinand's injury. I find acts of heroic sacrifice makes me much more emotional than acts of evil and suffering. The latter is so common in the headlines that I've become desensitized to them. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.